Breaking news. Simultaneous explosion of 4 British tankers in just 24 hours. Starmer is in shock and furious. London demands immediate answers as Moscow appears to be playing by IOUR strategic rules.
Hello, everyone. My name is Clark Jackson. Crucial geopolitical update at a time when the world is once again rocked by a dramatic escalation at sea. Today we analyze what could be one of the most explosive confrontations between London and Moscow since the start of the current war. What we are witnessing today goes far beyond a simple isolated maritime incident. It is an unprecedented shockwave reverberating from the corridors of power in London to the decks of merchant ships in international waters. Within 24 hours, not one, but 4 UK-linked tankers were struck by massive explosions, propelling what was previously a grey area of maritime confrontation into an open global security crisis. According to several independent analyses and incidents confirmed by maritime authorities, these explosions are not isolated accidents or simple mechanical errors. They are part of a series of dramatic events affecting ships often referred to as the shadow fleet, those obscure fleets of oil tankers that sail under opaque flags to circumvent economic sanctions against Moscow. These ships, already at the heart of diplomatic and economic controversies, now appear to be becoming walking targets in an undeclared naval war. In some images shared by Turkish authorities, columns of thick black smoke can be seen rising above the sea, clear signs that coordinated explosions struck metal hulls, causing intense fires. In recent incidents, Ukrainian drones have been linked to at least 2 attacks on sanctioned tankers in the Black Sea, one of which was attacked using small, unmanned naval units dubbed Sea Baby, causing extensive damage before the crew was safely evacuated. But what is happening today is even more alarming. The axis of these explosions has extended far beyond the traditional Black Sea theater to maritime zones that are now drawing the attention of Western powers. Some reports mention explosions, confirmed by AFP, off the coast of Dakar, Senegal, where an oil tanker was struck by 4 successive external explosions, proof that these attacks are no longer confined to a single region of the globe. As maritime authorities continue to gather technical information, several hypotheses are circulating: coordinated drone attacks, sea mines, or even clandestine sabotage operations directly targeting British interests. But the key question on everyone's lips among political analysts and military leaders remains the same. Who has an interest in attacking 4 British tankers in such a short period, and why now? This is no longer an isolated incident. It's a series of strategic attacks that cast a persistent shadow over global trade routes, energy markets, and international naval security. And while governments still hesitate to definitively attribute these explosions to a specific source, a stark truth is emerging. Modern warfare is no longer confined to land battlefields, it now sails across our oceans. What is happening with these massive explosions is not simply an isolated act of maritime violence, it is a political crisis of potentially historic proportions. The British Prime Minister is described in the corridors of power as not just frustrated, but extremely angry, characterizing these attacks as not only hostile acts, but also as an extremely clear strategic message to London and its Western allies. This tension is reaching levels not seen since the start of the war in Ukraine, and it raises a fundamental question. Is this merely a tactical escalation or a calculated maneuver by a power-seeking dominance? London is on a war footing. For months, the British government has intensified its sanctions strategy against the network of ships known as the Shadow Fleet, the fleet of clandestine oil tankers that illegally transport Russian hydrocarbons to circumvent Western restrictions. In 2025, the UK imposed unprecedented sanctions, targeting up to 83% of all non-sanctioned Russian oil exports, while calling on its partners to further tighten the noose around these ships, which, according to London, not only undermine the effectiveness of embargoes but also threaten global maritime security. But what was intended as leverage for economic pressure has turned into a spiral of retaliation. Smuggling fleets continue to thrive, despite bans on port services and restrictions on maritime transport. And behind these actions, a darker dynamic is emerging, a strategic confrontation on vital trade routes, where every incident can be interpreted as a sign that the economic sanctions have triggered something more aggressive than anticipated. Some political analysts suggest that this surge in violence could be a targeted response from Russian networks or their allies, seeking to disrupt Western supplies and test the resilience of sanctions. Others see it as part of a broader spectrum of hybrid actions, where clandestine naval operations, maritime drones, and the manipulation of ghost ships become weapons in an unconventional arsenal. The British strategy of massively sanctioning these tankers has also created counter-pressure effects. The government has even recently extended these sanctions to include suppliers and entities associated with these clandestine fleets, while simultaneously calling for increased international partnership to close the last loopholes in the embargoes. In this context, the naval confrontation is no longer just a series of isolated events. It reflects an implicit geopolitical war, where each explosion, each sanction, and each countersanction outlines the contours of a new global maritime order. And at the heart of this strategic game, the most pressing question remains: are we witnessing a planned escalation or a desperate response to a clandestine network that has become uncontrollable? At the heart of the tanker crisis, what unfolds on the oceans cannot be separated from the deep fault lines and explosive tensions that define global geopolitics today. Washington, London, and Brussels are watching every move with extreme attention, because the implications are no longer limited to the depths of the sea. They directly impact energy security, transatlantic alliances, and global power dynamics. For several weeks now, there has been a significant escalation in the use of offensive technologies beyond traditional theaters of warfare. Ukrainian drones have struck ships linked to Russia, including a Shadow Fleet oil tanker in the Mediterranean Sea, a first that marks a major strategic shift in the intensification of naval warfare. These attacks, far from being isolated incidents, are part of a systematic campaign aimed at weakening Russian oil revenues and disrupting the economic flows that finance Moscow's war effort. Washington, for its part, is following these events very closely. The United States has been compelled to exert its full diplomatic and military weight in this conflict, which has expanded since the invasion of Ukraine. Today, any maritime attack involving British or Western interests is scrutinized at the White House, the Pentagon, and within intelligence agencies. This situation complicates an already strained coalition between London, Brussels, and Washington regarding economic sanctions and measures to be taken against the illegal maritime networks that supply Moscow with financial resources despite the embargo. This international context is also marked by direct effects on the global market. Energy markets, already weakened by years of fluctuations due to the pandemic and structural changes in supply and demand, are now under additional pressure linked to the instability surrounding Russian exports. Every attack on infrastructure, whether it be oil platforms in the Caspian Sea or tankers in the Mediterranean, fuels increased price volatility and raises serious questions about the security of international energy supplies. For their part, Moscow and its leaders are exploiting this dynamic to send political and strategic messages of rare intensity. The Kremlin promises a response to any attack against what it considers vital economic infrastructure, despite Western warnings. This puts Russia in a position where every maritime incident can be interpreted as a calculated power maneuver, designed to disrupt supply chains and test the strategic cohesion of the Western coalition. This high-stakes game of power, sanctions, and countersanctions is not simply a series of isolated events, but rather a push toward a redefinition of the world order, where every explosion, every drone strike, and every political decision redraws the boundaries of international power. And in this context, the question remains: how far will this escalation go before more direct and potentially explosive responses are triggered? What is unfolding at sea today is no longer a mere succession of explosions and incidents. It is a new frontier in global geopolitical warfare, a strategic struggle whose repercussions extend far beyond the maritime domain to reshape the rules of the international order. At the heart of this confrontation lies the control of trade routes, but also the ability of major powers to impose sanctions and dictate the terms of energy and economic security for Europe and the West. It is no longer simply a battle on the Ukrainian front, but a struggle for economic supremacy, for the credibility of alliances, and for the survival of pressure tactics against an adversary that refuses to yield. In London, the reaction is explosive. The British government, already engaged in a vast sanctions campaign against dozens, sometimes hundreds, of ships suspected of being part of Russia's Ghost Fleet, sees these attacks as a strategic affront, a direct retaliation for its firm policy of economic pressure. The UK intensified these measures in 2025, adding dozens of tankers and entities to the sanctions lists to undermine the financing of the Russian conflict. On the other hand, Moscow makes no secret of its contempt for these efforts. While the West expected the sanctions to weaken the Russian economy, the Kremlin has used complex networks of diversion to maintain the flow of oil revenues. Hundreds of ships continue to operate under opaque flags, regularly changing names and flags to evade tracking, thus fueling a clandestine industry ready to defy international maritime law. Washington, though deeply alarmed, finds itself in a delicate strategic position. The United States is strengthening its sanctions campaign, such as increased interception of ships linked to illicit networks in the Caribbean, while simultaneously seeking to avoid a direct military escalation with Russia or an open confrontation that would ignite multiple theaters of operation at once. This context further fragments a coalition which, despite its apparent cohesion, is beginning to show signs of tension and diverging interests. London wants to strike hard, Brussels wants to stabilize the markets, and Washington wants to contain the situation without triggering a wider conflict. Meanwhile, Moscow claims that every attack is part of an inevitable economic war and continues to maintain that these actions will only strengthen its resolve. On global markets, the impact is immediate. Uncertainty in shipping routes, increased risks for insurers, and attacks extending even beyond traditional conflict zones are forcing a rethinking of maritime transport security as a whole. So, faced with this spiraling escalation, one question is on everyone's lips. How far will we go before a more direct, even more explosive response completely redefines the rules of the game? In this war of influence, economics, and power, every second counts, and tomorrow could well be worse than today.